gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. To Q or not to Q? This is the question. Actually, that was actually what I said.
Yeah, that's
when
right.
You and Dr. Goodacre had your debate on
That's
MythVision.
right, yeah.
Both gentlemen, Dr. Carrier, Dr. MacDonald, doesn't believe in Q, believes in Q. However, in this particular short clip that we could do here, I'd like us to find what you agree on and then where you both have rubber hit the road and go in different directions.
Yeah.
So finding the similarities of like what books come first, who's using what, how do we know, like what red flags give you the ideas of this, and I'll let you gentlemen hash it out.
Well, actually, I think Richard and I walked down the same road quite a ways before we get to the point of division. And I think it can be understood this way. First of all, to solve the synoptic problem, one ought not overly appeal to oral tradition, but needs to take seriously the intertextuality of the Gospels as a literary project and not an oral memory project.
Yeah, and that is a key point where we agree as well. So, and I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that, but we both agree that this is a literary project. These are interaction between texts. They're working from texts, not oral lore.
The second place we would agree is, I think, that Mark is the earliest of the synoptic gospels and of all the canonical gospels, most likely. And once one makes that statement, and by the way, the reason that we would say that is in narratives that are shared between Mark and Matthew and Luke never show what people might call reversed priority. Never is, in these texts, can one make a clear case that Matthew is more primitive than Mark or Luke is more primitive than Matthew or Luke. There are other places in the Gospels without narratives, though, where it would be different. Another place where we agree against the dominant position on the synoptic Gospels has to do with Luke's knowledge of Matthew. The two dominant positions in the synoptic problem right now, and there are minor ones that we can talk about that appear actually in my synopsis by comparison, are the two-document hypothesis and the FAR hypothesis, and Mark Goodacre is a primary spokesperson for that. What distinguishes them are the commitments of the two-document hypothesis to Luke's independence of Matthew and Mark's independence of anything that Matthew and Luke have in agreement against Mark. Now, that methodology is problematic on a number of scores, and that gets us into the weeds too quickly. I want to stay, I want to just mow the grass at this point without pulling weeds. The other dominant position is the FAR hypothesis that feasts on the problems of the two-document hypothesis and takes two forms. One is simply skepticism about Q, or the dismissal of Q, even as a possibility. And one of the major reasons that scholars do that is that we have ample evidence that Luke knows Matthew. Now, I want to give and this is one place where Richard and I agree. So at this point, he and I are on the same road, but we're soon going to come to the division of the road, and we can talk about that today or another time. First of all, we have so-called minor agreements between Matthew and Luke. And now we are in some weeds. A minor agreement is a place where Matthew clearly has redacted Mark, and the same redactional shifts appear in Luke. How can that happen? So advocates of the two-document hypothesis do gymnastics in order to explain through textual criticism or parallel traditions or whatever, how it is that you have those agreements. But some of the agreements, in fact, many of them are not so minor, and they can be quite important in the recovery of the tradition. I add two other arguments to it. Three other arguments. Is it accidental that we have overlapping content between Luke and Matthew in their infancy narratives?
Right, yeah.
And in overlapping content in their passion narratives? It's likely that Luke saw what Matthew did with the infancy of Jesus and said, I can do better, and I'm going to throw in the birth of John the Baptist. Thank you very much. And then he saw what was going on in Matthew, and he could write a better resurrection story and passion story than Matthew did. This is a form of mimesis, transvaluative mimesis, where authors take, they're not copying, they're not scribes, they're real authors that are changing the narrative, but based on a model that they see and admire. Another is Papias and Luke have similarities in their prologues, and this we can talk some other time, and it's very technical. But if Luke knew Papias, he had to know about Matthew, because Papias says that his project has to do with restoring the primitive order of a gospel that was written in Hebrew, written by Matthew, that two Greek translators botched up. And if Luke knew Papias, he had to know of Matthew. Related to that is the relative late dating of the Gospel of Luke and Acts now, and that those dates put it after Papias. So any similarities between Luke and Papias should be explained is Luke's knowledge of Papias and not the other way around. And that actually is a relatively new and revolutionary commitment.
Yeah, it also can't be the other way around, in my opinion, because Papias clearly doesn't know about Luke.
He does, or John,
so,
right.
Right, so I mean, if there's connections between them, it has to go the one way.
That's exactly right.
Logic.
And finally,
we have agreement, by the way.
So far. And Papias has a lurid account of the death of Judas, which is very similar to the death of Judas in the Acts of the Apostles. And in a very technical argument, I show that Luke must be dependent on Papias and not the other way around, including the arguments that Richard just made, that if you have such similarities in these stories, Papias doesn't know Luke, and Luke says he knows many people who have tried to put these narratives together.
Yeah, right.
So the question then becomes, and by the way, I've been disowned by advocates of the two-document hypothesis. I thought I was helping them, and now I'm pariah. And so I don't know what to do with that. But I hold to the Q document, but without the shortcomings, I hope, of the two-document hypothesis. So I'm more optimistic about having an alternative methodology for reconstructing Q, whereas apparently Richard shares some of Mark Goodacre's skepticism about the success of recovering.
There actually is a slight more agreement in there, in the sense that, so my position is Occam's razor, right? It's easier. If you think like, well, Q starts to look, it looks like Mark with additions. Well, that's just Matthew, right? So we don't need an extra document. But at the same time, if there is a Q, your method of reconstructing it is far closer to correct than any other Q advocate that I've seen, right? Wow. So I think, if there is a Q, it's got to be something like what Dennis is doing with it, because it can't be this circular argument where stuff in Mark wasn't in Q. Well, how do you know that? You don't know that other than your circular argument that it's not in what you've constructed of the Q material, right? And the same thing is like you can't assume that we have everything from Q. Like if there was Q, there might be stuff in it that was left on the cutting room floor, right? And there's a lot of other points about this. And then also at the same time, it's obvious Luke is using Matthew. So you have to, whatever theory you have of Q, it has to incorporate that. You have to admit that.
That's right.
And so you have to figure out, well, then what's happening here? What's going on? And the idea that Dennis is doing is where he's saying like, well, if we start with a theory that doesn't presume anything and say we can try and figure out like what actually does look like it isn't being original to Matthew, it isn't original to Luke, it isn't being borrowed from Mark necessarily, can we see a commonality in that material that's different from the other remaining material? And in his case, like he sees like all these Deuteronomy references. And so he could construct, well, it looks like we've got this whole other narrative that doesn't even agree with their narrative. Like it doesn't have the dying Jesus. It doesn't have the crucifixion. It doesn't have a lot of the atonement narrative and the stuff that the Gospels want to tell. So it's kind of like a different Jesus. It looks like a different Gospel. That's a plausible methodology. I don't think it holds together. I think there's more. I think what we're seeing here is we're seeing the same redaction, kind of the same sort of mimesis that's going with Homer, they're doing with Deuteronomy. I think the Gospel authors are doing this. I don't think it's Q doing this. I think it's kind of coincidental that you can construct different Jesus when you put these particular passages together. But that's just my take on it.
Do you think it's interesting, though, that MacDonald points out, and I never really thought about this deeply, even though I've heard him say this, that Luke knew Papias, okay? If you grant... Let's go into the deep water here. On the historicity, you talk about how ridiculous Papias' story of Judas is. And it is. It's so funny.
Oh, yeah.
His testicles have worms coming out.
And his body swells to the size of a wagon trail. Yeah, it's...
But I find it interesting. His point is well taken. He pointed this out earlier. If Eusebius is fabricating all of Papias, right? We went into this. Why the hell would he create a problem?
Oh, wait, so you've heard people suggest that Eusebius has fabricated Papias? I haven't heard that theory before.
Well, some people talk about
Oh, okay.
So it's been something that was brought up.
Oh, how weird. I don't think that's likely at all, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something...
I mean, Papias is too embarrassing.
That's what
Eusebius Eusebius is almost annoyed that he has to use Papias.
And he's so selective when he does it. Yeah, he left a lot on the cutting room floor.
Right, yeah.
This is an interesting thing, like... Could it be, and I'm throwing it out there as a hypothetical, could Luke know Papias, yet Q still not be true in your mind?
Of course, yeah.
So you're willing to go that far even to say
I don't know how decisively, I think it looks tantalizing that Luke is writing in response to Papias. It's more than just that he knew Papias. It's like Papias said some things, Luke was annoyed, and then decided to solve the problem that Papias was basically claiming existed. And so that is a plausible sequence of events. And part of this is the problem that we can't know for sure when Papias wrote, right? Like we don't have exact dates. Like people estimate, and so we're not really sure. And a lot of other ancillary arguments hinge on where you peg the date of it. So there's Christian apologists salivate at the idea that Papias was early rather than late, right? Now I think that's a bad position to take for them because Papias is so unreliable. He's almost admittedly unreliable. Like he describes his methods, and his methods are terrible methods. Are absolutely not the methods you should use. So, so he's almost telling you not to trust him. But so it doesn't really matter what his date is. But
that's good.
But so for me, I am not convinced. Like I'm not going to go starting arguments from the premise that Luke used Papias or knew Papias. But I'm completely comfortable with the idea, and I'm tantalized by the arguments. The evidence is suggestive. It at least raises the probability higher than it would have been otherwise.
Well, I want to defend myself a little bit, but then back away and say, I know that my reconstruction of Q pus, or the logo of Jesus, is not a xerographic copy of what that text was. I can't even be sure that Luke and Mark and Matthew had a similar copy of it, so that
that's also a good point. And people overlook this a lot. Same with the Mark, by the way. They might not necessarily have the same.
There's no way of knowing. There's no way of controlling it. And even if I reconstructed everything correctly, there would be no way of knowing that I did.
Right. Yeah.
So it all is based on probabilities and not on certainties.
Yeah.
And some people would like more certainty in the project, especially if they're going to build theological constructions
Right.
on the basis of it.
Yeah.
Now, I also want to say, and I think Richard would agree with this, that there is a strong plausibility that there was at least one lost gospel before the writing of Luke Acts. Papias talks about 2 Gospels of Matthew that had different sequences, and we have only one of them. Luke talks about many who had tried to put together a narrative, and most solutions to the Synoptic Problem mention only 2, either Mark and Q or Mark and Matthew. I argue for 4. Now, the other thing that we haven't mentioned yet is social identity theory. And whereas most reconstructions of Q rely heavily on issues theological and literary, I rely more on the mimesis and social identity theory. That is, there is a substratum to the gospel tradition, in my view, that represents a social context that is different from Mark and the other synoptics. Now, that requires really a different session for us to talk, because that really does get in the weeds. But I think it's lamentable that the Synoptic Problem, I don't want to leave the Synoptic Problem just to people who are skeptical about reconstructing the lost gospel. I think it's worth the effort to try to reconstruct it, although I am fully aware that I will fail ultimately in that task. My goal is to win horseshoes not with ringers, but with leaners. If you know what I mean, if you played enough horseshoes. So close is going to be good enough if it's better than people whose horseshoes are farther away. So that's the game I'm playing.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to say?
Well, I mean, this is somewhat unrelated. It's an analogy that changes gears entirely. We have a similar thing where we're looking at Luke Acts and the trend lately. Now, this is an early theory, and now there's a lot of support for it. There's a lot more support for it now, which is that Luke, the author of Luke Acts, is using Josephus's Antiquities as basically color text. He's getting all kinds of stuff that he's going to use to dress his stories up with. Details about the narrative, the census of Quirinius. He's using all of these details. We even have, and it seems like, so there's two questions to answer here. With Codex Bezae, there's this other version of Luke Acts, and in this version, there is a reference to the empty tomb story, where it says, and this is a text of Luke, a manuscript of Luke, it says it took 20 men to open the door to the empty tomb. And the structure of the sentence and everything is very similar to the story in Josephus about when he boasts that it took 20 men to open the doors to the temple. And so it looks like someone is creating an allusion to the temple, between the empty tomb and the temple, etc., and God fleeing. Because Josephus is talking about God fled the temple, and that's why the Jews got defeated. And then, God has left the empty tomb. And so there's a lot of these analogies. So there's either two explanations of this. One is someone is expanding Luke later on who actually knows Luke is using Josephus and keeps doing it. Or this comes from an original text of Luke that shows more reliance on Josephus. I don't have a dog in either race on that one. But the significant point is that we see all of these allusions. There's lots of examples, really good cases where Luke even makes mistakes that show us how he's using Josephus and so on. But there's a whole section of Luke in Acts particular, that doesn't take place in Judea. It takes place in the Aegean, right? There's a lot of travel around Greece and Turkey and so on, what will become modern Turkey. And it has a lot of the similar color detail. So the question is, it looks like, my assumption would be that Luke he was using some text, an Aegean history historian, that he was borrowing color text from, just as he used Josephus to borrow the other color text from. Now, can I prove this? No, I can't prove this, but I do suspect it very strongly. I think he's getting the color text from some other historian who just wasn't preserved because he wasn't preserving the history of Christianity or Judaism, so the Christians weren't interested in it. So whatever history that was, and we know there were tons of these histories, right? Tons of these histories were written that no one was interested in, and they tossed, and you don't get to read them. So we're lucky to even have things like Josephus' Antiquities and such. So that's an example. of where I think like there might be something there, that there's a lost text that Luke is using. It's not a Christian text. It has nothing to do with Christianity, but he's using it in the same way that he's using Josephus. And so I see that as plausible. So what Dennis is talking about is the same kind of thing. I see that as plausible, but for the same reason, I don't think that we can prove it. Is basically.
Thank you, and we will have to pick this up at another time. But I want to go back to that wonderful insertion into, or what I think is the original text. I think Codex Bezae has the original text.
I have a suspicion of that, but I just can't prove it.
Well, but there are indications. For example, he doesn't talk about the stone. The other text, the canonical, the received, the dominant text.
The version everybody believes is the original.
Right. Doesn't talk about a rock being put in front of the tomb. And then later it says, and the rock at the tomb, which hadn't been mentioned. It didn't say a rock that covered the tomb or whatever. But here's another amazing intertext. The stone over the cave of Polyphemus is enormous. 20 wagons could not remove it from the cave.
The specific
door.
number 20 appears in the story. That's fascinating. So, which would suggest that possibly Josephus is doing the same thing, right?
Josephus could do the same thing. Bezae could do the same thing, but I think Luke could do the same thing.
Oh yeah, right.
So, but it's 20 people could not move the stone. When the Homeric Centones retell the story. No, I'm sorry, the Gospel of Nicodemus, when he retells the story, Joseph of Arimathea removes the stone that not even 20 people could move, and that makes Joseph Superman.
Right.
And it really is a very...
It's worth pointing out that the text, the manuscript we're talking about of Luke in Acts, Codex Bezae, is 10 to 20% longer than the one that everyone normally is reading. So there's actually tons of new material in there. And it's weird, like little throwaway sentences here and there.
And a lot of it is secondary.
So there's other question of like, is all of it original or is some of it original and some of it added and so on. It is one of the most fascinating texts, and it's also one of the least cited or least referenced texts. Most people don't know about the weird and interesting verses that are in that
Western
version.
non-interpolations. No, that's what they're called.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.